I'll confess it feels a little odd to preach when such of the emphasis in the gospel is the silence of the disciples. So I'll start with a quote from Omar Mohammed El-Akkad. "Something has ended here, but something else begins. The dead dig wells in the living." What death is unacceptable to you? For me, my first unacceptable death was actually a video game character from the game Final Fantasy VII. Yeah, I know. Oh, I hear some, okay, recognition there. Okay, yeah, awesome. It is a character that you spend half of the game with, half of the story, and their death is sudden. It's not sacrificial. It's not even all that dramatic. It is simply tragic, painful, and final. I do not know why this fictional character's death affected me so much. I grew up with Harry Potter, and spoiler alert, a lot of people die in those books. Perhaps it was how I found this character relatable. Perhaps it was my growing awareness of mortality. Perhaps it was the way that I played this game right after the death of a childhood friend's mother. Regardless, I found this character's death unacceptable. So I tried to undo it. I scoured the early 2000s internet for ways to prevent this character's death, but no strategy could be found. It was simply part of the story, programmed in, a canon event. But I found communities of people who also could not accept this character's death and had developed ways of hacking into the game's code to program the character back to life. It's kind of weird. It took about 2 days to make happen, and it was unsatisfying. It didn't change the story. The character was not truly resurrected. They were just a shell, a husk, just pretend. Yet still other fans of this video game kept this character alive through the noble art of fan fiction. The art of taking one story and making it your own. These fan fiction authors created an alternate reality that kept the character alive and imagined a different path for the story to take. And I won't lie, for a long time I found joy in reading and even writing hours upon hours of these fan fictions, but it was also insufficient. It didn't change the fact that the official reality of this character's story had come to a brutal, unacceptable end. And the truth is that I never got over this character's death. To this day, it troubles me. I shudder whenever I recall it, whenever I witness or experience another death. I remember from this lesson that death is never okay. A death is never going to get better. For someone, each person's death in this world is unacceptable. And while grief might allow us to move on, live on, we will never truly recover. We will never be able to live free from the way that an unacceptable death shatters our faith in life. Unless death is not meant to be acceptable or accepted, unless death and life are not meant to be understood as opposites, but as the bridge between the new life God brings into the world, unless the faith that is trust in the God who is love does truly give us the power to refuse to accept the finality of death and declare that those who have died are, beyond all logic and likelihood, alive. Why do you look for the living among the dead? Asks the young men who came to the women after these women had come to care for the man whose death they felt was unacceptable. Behind the immovable stone of this tomb lay the teacher, the Messiah, who incorporated women as leaders in his ministry, who lifted up the right of women to proclaim God's liberation through song, service, word, and lament, who embraced solidarity with all the oppressed of the world and shared the divine power of his Spirit with rampant, near irresponsible trust, making the world feel like a place where love could truly win. How could they bear to think that he is gone? Well, reality, for one thing. They had watched his betrayal and execution take place and seen him buried in the tomb. The empire also emphasized Jesus' death. They had exerted the power of the death penalty publicly as a reminder that they could and would kill anyone who opposed them and could make them stay dead. The disciples, Jesus' closest friends, were also pretty convinced of Jesus' death. Those who had witnessed miracles from Jesus, but knew that it was simply more sensible to believe that they had just backed the wrong Messiah than to believe that through God all things are truly possible. And yet, these women receive a different account of possibility. A different story than that offered by the empire, the disciples, by the laws of reality, from a strange duo of young men dressed in white, sitting in a tomb where their friend, their Messiah, their unacceptable death was supposed to be dead. And they tell them to stop looking for the living among the dead, to stop accepting the unacceptable, to begin imagining the unimaginable, to believe that life and death are not opposites, are certainly not final, but are merely the building blocks of God's new creation that we call resurrection. For to look for the living among the dead is to deny God's power to bring change. And to look for the living only among the living is to worship only glory. But to look for the dead among the living, that is to join God's transformation of grieving that makes all things new, beginning with you and the death you find unacceptable. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of Jesus, all the women with them took the advice of these young men in the tomb and stopped looking for the living among the dead. But their response was to proclaim that Jesus is risen before they had proof. They refused to accept Jesus' death and began to look for the dead, Jesus, in the living. Beginning with themselves, their faith unleashed the presence of Jesus within them, within their bodies, within their memory, and it transformed them into the first witnesses of the resurrection, the foundation of the Christian message of liberation from all forms of oppression, all forms of being trapped in sin and death. Because when you refuse to accept that death is the end, that the empire and all the powers of this world claim that it is, you reject their power over you, and you reject the participation in the many forms of dealing death. When you refuse to accept that death is the end, you reject the inevitability of apathy, the idea that the best way to live life is ambivalent attachment, and become willing to sacrifice everything so that all people may know and trust and live like they are dearly loved children of God. When you refuse to accept that death is the end, you stop looking for the living among the dead and begin seeing everyone who has died and the living who have been transformed by their memory. To break the chains of this world and let God's love break into the world. This is the only acceptable response to death that I have found. Even in the case of a fictional character from a video game from 1997, I was transformed by their death, the death of this story. And I found that this fictional character who had died now lived in me, along with everyone else I've known who has died. Another manifestation of Jesus' unacceptable death, which finds resurrection in my life and my memory. And I have seen Jesus' resurrection take place throughout the world recently. I was in Minnesota when the American Empire killed George Floyd, declared him irreparably dead. But a community and world refused to accept his death, and his resurrection manifested in an uprising that shook the powers of the world through the bodies of people and all races, declaring that hatred, fear, racism, and death are incompatible with the truth of God's undying love for all. We see it today as far too many powers in this world turn apathetic eyes away from the many forms of genocide and murder taking place, including in the land of Jesus' people, where tens of thousands of Palestinians have been murdered, many of them children. and we have been asked to consider their deaths acceptable. But many have also refused and have allowed the dead to be resurrected in the movement to end genocide everywhere. And I have experienced Jesus' resurrection within this congregation, where I have seen people go through unimaginable loss and tragedy, but have been embraced by a community who has refused to accept the inevitability of death and loss and has allowed themselves to be transformed through their trust that God is making all things new through the faith that is trust in the God who is love. For just as Jesus Christ died for all, so Jesus Christ rises for all and rises in all who have died, allowing them to find the new life, death of resurrection, to transform those of us who knew them to live with a love greater than we could live without them. So let us carry the witness of those who have died in our transformed bodies, our resurrection bodies, and refuse to accept the false separation of sin and death, and believe in the love of God that brings all things together to make all things possible. Because when the powers of this world say that they have the power to force death to be final, Jesus' resurrection calls us to proclaim that new life rises. So I ask you again, what death is unacceptable? Is it someone close to you, a family member or friend? Is it someone whose death you have heard about? Victim of genocide, police violence, the epidemic of drug overdoses, a victim of anti-transgender violence or Christian nationalism? Is it the earth itself or a part of creation dear to you that is suffering and dying? Is it Jesus? Whoever or whatever it is, I implore you to refuse to accept this death. Refuse to accept the limitations of the empire or the powers of this world or any oppressive force that says that death is the end, and instead embrace the transformation that comes from looking for the dead among the living, beginning with you and continuing with those around you who proclaim that Christ is risen. I ask you again, is Jesus Christ risen? Is Jesus risen? Then let us believe that all the dead are risen with him, and let us rise up, reject the shackles of oppression, and allow God's love and justice for all to dig wells in we, the living, and liberate the world with a resurrection that finds the dead among the living.